He wouldn't use guns or bombs. He would pick up a camera. Before he could declare war on Hollywood's lies, Oscar Micheaux first had to survive the harsh truths of the American frontier. He was not born a filmmaker. He was forged in the unforgiving crucible of the South Dakota plains, a world just as hostile, in its own way, as the segregated South he had fled. Born the son of former slaves in Illinois, Micheaux was possessed by a restless ambition that the limited world of Jim Crow could not contain. He worked as a train porter, a job that allowed him to see the vastness of the country, and in his travels he heard about a place that sounded like a dream, the frontier. A place where a man, any man, could claim a piece of land and build a life through sheer force of will. In the early 1900s, he did the unthinkable. He took his life savings and moved to an all-white area of South Dakota to become a homesteader. This was not a romantic adventure. It was a brutal, isolating existence. He lived in a sod house, battling blizzards that could bury a man alive, droughts that turned the earth to dust, and the deep, gnawing loneliness of the plains. But more than the weather, he battled the quiet, constant pressure of prejudice. His white neighbors watched him with suspicion, some with outright hostility, waiting for the lone black man in their midst to fail. But Micheaux refused to fail. He worked harder, his crops grew taller, his land became more prosperous than many of his neighbors. He was proving, with his own callous hands, that the racist stereotypes about black indolence were a lie. He was not just building a farm, he was building an argument. An argument for black capability, for self-reliance, for a manhood that was defined not by race, but by grit and determination. It was this experience, this lonely war against the elements and against prejudice, that would become the raw material for his art. He began to write. At night, after a back-breaking day in the fields, he would light a lamp and pour his experiences onto the page, creating an autobiographical novel titled The Conquest, the Story of a Negro Pioneer. It was a raw, honest, and powerful story, and it was a hit. The book, which he self-published and sold door to door, found a passionate audience in the black community, who had never before seen their own pioneering spirit reflected in literature. His success caught the attention of a fledgling right, and they wanted to bring his story to the screen. But as Micheaux sat in that boardroom, he discovered the bitter truth about power, even black power, in a world dominated by white expectations. The producers had one major, non-negotiable demand: the ending of his story had to be changed. In his novel, the hero, a black homesteader, ultimately triumphs over adversity and prejudice, winning the land and the woman he loves. The producers found this ending unrealistic, even dangerous. They insisted on a more tragic, and in their view, more believable, conclusion where the hero is driven off his land and loses everything. For Micheaux, this was more than just a creative disagreement. It was a fundamental betrayal of his entire philosophy. He had not written a story about black failure. He had written a story about black resilience. His hero's triumph was the entire point. It was the argument he had forged in the blizzards of South Dakota. To change the ending was to concede to the very racist narrative he was trying to destroy, the narrative that said a black man, no matter how capable or determined, was ultimately doomed to fail in a white man's world. Micheaux looked at the men across the table and saw not allies, but gatekeepers, men who were willing to soften the truth to make it more palatable for the status quo. What was the point of making a race film, if it only confirmed the racist beliefs of the audience? In a moment that would define his life, Oscar Micheaux stood up, walked out of that boardroom, and made a decision of almost unimaginable audacity. If they wouldn't tell his story the right way, he would do it himself. He, a man with zero filmmaking experience, a man with no connections to the powerful new world of Hollywood, would start his own movie studio. It was an idea that was, by any rational measure, insane. The film industry was a closed ecosystem, controlled by a handful of powerful white moguls. The cost of cameras, film stock, and processing was astronomical. And the very idea of a black man not just acting in, but producing and directing his own feature films was so far outside the realm of possibility that it was laughable. But Micheaux was not a rational man in that sense. He was a man possessed by a vision, and he had the unshakable self-confidence of someone who had already built a world for himself out of nothing on the prairie. He returned to the very people who had bought his book, the farmers, the doctors, the teachers, the preachers, the Pullman porters of the black middle class. He traveled from town to town, from church to church, not just selling his novel, but selling shares. Shares in a dream. He stood before them and made his pitch. Hollywood is poisoning our children's minds with racist lies. They show us as clowns, servants, and savages. It is our duty to fight back, to tell our own stories, to show our own beauty and our own truth on the screen. Invest in me, and we will build an industry of our own. It was a revolutionary message, and it resonated deeply. He was not just asking for money, he was offering them a chance to participate in a cultural war. People invested. $1 here, $5 there. It was a grassroots, crowd-funded movement, decades before the term existed. With this seed money, scraped together from the pockets of ordinary people who believed in his vision, he founded the Micheaux Film and Book Company in Chicago. He was now a studio head. His first act was to adapt his own novel, The Homesteader, into a feature film. He wrote the screenplay, he directed it, he produced it. He hired an all-black cast. He did it all, learning the craft of filmmaking on the fly, driven by pure, raw determination. The result, released in 1919, was a sensation. It was the first feature film ever made by an African-American director. And it was everything the Lincoln Company had been afraid of. It was a story of a black man who was intelligent, ambitious, and ultimately triumphant. It was a box office hit in the segregated, colored theaters across the country. Oscar Micheaux had not just made a movie, he had proven that a market and an audience existed for authentic black stories, told by black voices. He had created a beachhead. Now, he was ready to launch his main assault. And his target was the most successful and most racist film ever made. The Birth of a Nation. With the success of The Homesteader, Oscar Micheaux had proven that he could make a film. Now, he had to prove that his films could be a weapon. He was not content to simply create entertainment. He was a cultural warrior, and he had a dragon to slay. That dragon was D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. It is difficult to overstate the toxic impact of that 1915 film. While it was a groundbreaking masterpiece of cinematic technique, its content was a vile and powerful piece of racist propaganda. It glorified the Ku Klux Klan, depicting them as heroic saviors of the South, and it portrayed black people as either loyal, simple-minded servants or as brutish, lustful animals who were a threat to white civilization. The film was a cultural phenomenon, and it was directly responsible for a massive resurgence of the KKK and a new wave of racial violence across America. Micheaux knew he could not let this stand. He could not allow this poisonous narrative to be the only story told about his people. He decided to create a direct, furious, and unapologetic response. His weapon would be his second feature film, a project that would become his most important and most controversial work. Within Our Gates. Released in 1920, just a year after his first film, it was a cinematic declaration of war. If The Birth of a Nation was history written with lightning, as President Wilson had said then, Within Our Gates was the thunderous clapback, a truth told with fire. The film tells the complex story of a young, educated black woman from the South named Sylvia Landry, who travels north to raise money for a rural school for black children. Through her journey, Micheaux exposes the brutal realities of the Jim Crow era in a way that no film had ever dared to before. But the film's true power, the element that made it so revolutionary and so dangerous, was a shocking, extended flashback sequence that depicted the hidden history of Sylvia's family. In this sequence, Micheaux showed what white America refused to see, the unvarnished horror of a lynching. He did not shy away from the brutality. He showed a white mob, their faces twisted in hate, hunting down Sylvia's innocent father. He showed him being dragged from his home, beaten, and then hanged from a tree while her mother is also murdered. This was the first time that the reality of lynching, a form of domestic terrorism that had claimed the lives of thousands of Black Americans, had ever been depicted on the American screen from the perspective of the victims. It was a truth so raw, so horrific, that it was considered unfilmable. Micheaux filmed it. He forced his audience to look, to bear witness to a reality that the mainstream press and Hollywood either ignored or condoned. But he didn't stop there. The film directly confronted the sexual hypocrisy at the heart of the lynch mob mentality. In the climax of the flashback, a white landowner, enraged by the supposed uppityness of Sylvia's family, is about to be lynched himself by the white mob he's whipped into a frenzy. It's a stunning reversal, showing that mob violence is an indiscriminate monster. And in the film's most controversial and powerful scene, a white man attempts to sexually assault the film's heroine, Sylvia. It was a direct and explosive rebuttal to the central lie of the birth of a nation, which was predicated on the myth of the black man as a sexual predator. Micheaux flipped the script, exposing the reality that, for centuries, it was white men who had systematically used sexual violence as a tool of terror and control over black women. The reaction to "Within Our Gates" was immediate and explosive. Censor boards in cities across the country, from Chicago to Omaha to Atlanta, were horrified. They were not horrified by the racism of the birth of a nation, which they had largely approved. They were horrified by Micheaux's truth. They called his film dangerous, incendiary, and calculated to stir up racial hatred. They demanded massive cuts, particularly the lynching sequence and the attempted assault scene. They argued that showing such things would incite riots. Micheaux fought back with the same tenacity he had shown as a homesteader. He became his own legal counsel, his own lobbyist. He wrote passionate letters to the review boards, arguing for his First Amendment rights and for the necessity of telling the truth. To the Chicago board, he famously wrote, "I am a Negro. We are a race of people, 12 million strong. We are the only people who have not been permitted to see themselves as heroes on the screen. You ask that I cut the scene where the white man attacks the colored girl. You say it will cause race hatred. I say that race hatred is already here." He was not just fighting for his film, he was fighting for the right to exist, the right to define his own reality. In some cities he won. In others he was forced to make cuts. But the film was released, and for black audiences, it was a revelation. It was a film that spoke their truth, that reflected their pain, that showed their resilience. It was a film that said, "We see you. We honor your struggle." Within Our Gates, Oscar Micheaux had done more than answer D.W. Griffith. He had established himself as the most important and audacious voice in black cinema. He had proven that a film could be more than entertainment. It could be a testimony. And his testimony was just beginning. Within Our Gates was a declaration of war, but a single battle does not win a war. Oscar Micheaux knew that to truly combat the pervasive poison of Hollywood stereotypes, he needed to do more than just make one film. He needed to build an entire cinematic universe, a parallel world where black life was depicted in all of its complexity, richness, and diversity. For the next 30 years, that is exactly what he did. Working at a relentless pace, often writing, producing, and directing multiple films a year, he created a body of work that stands as a monumental act of cultural self-definition. What was so revolutionary about Micheaux's films was not just that they featured black actors, but the way they featured them. In the world that Micheaux created, the suffocating confines of the white imagination were shattered. He consciously and deliberately rejected the limited roles that Hollywood offered. In his films, black characters were not just servants, clowns, or victims. They were the heroes and villains, the protagonists and antagonists of their own stories. He gave his audiences something they had never seen before, a reflection of themselves as complex, modern, and fully human beings. He made films in every conceivable genre, claiming each one as a space for black storytelling. He made gritty crime dramas, exploring the dark underbelly of city life. He made sweeping historical epics. He made musicals that showcased the vibrant new sounds of jazz and blues. He even made westerns like The Brute and The Gonzales Mystery, placing black cowboys and lawmen at the center of America's most foundational myth, decades before Hollywood would ever dare to do so. He was not just making race films, he was making American films, but populating them with the people America had chosen to render invisible. His films tackled themes that were completely taboo in mainstream cinema. He was fearless. He made The Symbol of the Unconquered, a film that directly confronted the Ku Klux Klan. He made Birthright, a story about a young black Harvard graduate who chooses to return to the South to build a school, a powerful statement on black uplift and self-determination. He explored the complexities of colorism within the black community itself, the painful reality of passing for white, and the fraught dynamics of interracial relationships. These were not simple, feel-good stories. They were often raw, sometimes controversial, and always deeply engaged with the most pressing social and political issues of the day. He was using his camera as a scalpel, dissecting the sickness of American racism and the internal struggles of the community that had to endure it. Perhaps his greatest contribution, beyond his own films, was his role as a star maker. He understood that to build a new cinema, he needed a new kind of star. He sought out actors who could project intelligence, dignity, and charisma. He launched the careers of dozens of black actors who would have been relegated to minor, stereotyped roles in the Hollywood system. His greatest discovery, of course, was the legendary Paul Robeson. In 1925, Micheaux cast the young, unknown Robeson in his film Body and Soul. In the dual role of a corrupt, villainous preacher and his virtuous, upstanding twin brother, Robeson gave a performance of stunning power and complexity. Micheaux saw his genius, his commanding presence, and his incredible talent, and gave him the kind of multifaceted, challenging role that no white director would have offered him at the time. It was the film that launched Robeson's international acting career, and it was a testament to Micheaux's eye for talent and his commitment to showcasing black excellence. But creating this universe was a constant, grueling battle. Micheaux was a true independent, a guerrilla filmmaker operating completely outside the system. He had no studio backing, no established distribution network. His entire operation was a testament to his own relentless hustle. He would raise money for one film, shoot it as quickly and cheaply as possible, and then personally take the film reels on the road. He would travel from city to city, from one segregated theater to another, acting as his own promoter and distributor. He would stand outside the theater, charming audiences, selling them on his vision. He was part artist, part entrepreneur, part traveling salesman. He faced immense obstacles. His low budgets often meant his films lacked the technical polish of their Hollywood counterparts. The acting could be uneven, the sound quality poor. But what they lacked in polish, they made up for in passion and purpose. He was also in a constant war with state and local censor boards, who regularly tried to ban his films for their inflammatory content, a charge they rarely leveled at films that glorified racial violence, like The Birth of a Nation. His studios and film vaults were plagued by fires, some of them suspected to be arson, which destroyed the only copies of many of his early films, leaving them lost to history. And yet he never stopped. If a studio burned down, he raised the money to build another. If a film was banned in one city, he took it to the next. His resilience was as remarkable as his artistic vision. He was a filmmaker, yes, but more than that, he was a force of nature, a man who simply refused to be silenced. Oscar Micheaux was a titan, but even titans can be worn down by the relentless gravity of a changing world. The 1930s brought a series of challenges so immense that they would have crushed any lesser man. The first blow was economic. The Great Depression devastated the very audience that had sustained him. The black middle class and working class, who had invested in his company and bought tickets to his films, were hit harder than almost any other group in America. Suddenly, the dollar for a movie ticket was a dollar needed for food, for rent. The grassroots financial ecosystem that Micheaux had so brilliantly built began to crumble. His company, which had been a symbol of black economic independence, was forced into bankruptcy in 1928, just on the cusp of the Great Crash. The second blow was technological, and it was a revolution that threatened to make him obsolete. In 1927, The Jazz Singer was released, and the era of the silent film was suddenly over. The talkies, motion pictures with synchronized sound, had arrived. For the major Hollywood studios, this was a massive but manageable expense. For a scrappy independent like Micheaux, it was a cataclysm. The cost of sound equipment for both filming and projection was astronomical. Cameras were louder, requiring soundproof enclosures. Microphones were primitive and difficult to use. And the thousands of small, segregated theaters that were his lifeblood could not afford to convert to the new sound systems. His entire distribution network was in danger of being wiped out overnight. For a time, it seemed as if Micheaux's revolutionary run was over. But just as he had done when he walked out of that boardroom years before, he refused to accept defeat. He clawed his way back. He reorganized his company, sought out new investors, and scraped together enough money to make the transition to sound. In 1931, he released The Exile, his first talkie. It was a remarkable achievement, a testament to his sheer, bloody-minded refusal to quit. He had survived the 1-2 punch of the Depression and the sound revolution that had bankrupted so many of his competitors, both black and white. However, survival came at a cost. The financial pressures of the 1930s and 40s forced him to adapt. While he never abandoned his commitment to telling black stories, his films in this later period often became more commercial, more focused on the genres that he knew would sell tickets: gangster films, melodramas, and musicals. Some critics, both then and now, have argued that he lost some of his radical edge, that the fearless provocateur of Within Our Gates had been tempered by the harsh realities of the market. There may be some truth to that. His later films rarely reached the same heights of political audacity as his early masterpieces. But even in this more commercial phase, he never stopped pushing boundaries. He continued to create complex roles for black actors, to explore themes of ambition and betrayal within the community, and to present a world where black people were the masters of their own destiny. He also faced a new and unexpected form of competition: Hollywood itself. The major studios, seeing the success of independent race films, began to produce their own big-budget musicals and dramas with all-black casts, like Hallelujah and The Green Pastures. While these films were often filled with the same old stereotypes, their technical polish and massive marketing budgets made it nearly impossible for an independent like Micheaux to compete. He was fighting a war on all fronts. He was fighting a contracting economy, a rapidly changing technology, a hostile system of censorship, and now, the very Hollywood behemoth he had set out to challenge. It was a testament to his genius and his grit that he managed to continue making films at all. He was a survivor, a hustler, a man who willed his movies into existence through sheer force of personality. One of the greatest challenges he faced was the preservation of his own work. Film stock from that era was notoriously unstable, made of flammable nitrocellulose. Fires were a constant and devastating threat. A significant portion of Micheaux's filmography is now considered lost forever, destroyed in studio fires or simply allowed to decay over time due to neglect. We know of over 40 films that he made, but today, only a fraction of them survive. We have the titles, the posters, the tantalizing descriptions, but the moving images themselves are gone, ghosts of a cinematic universe that we can now only glimpse. This loss is an incalculable tragedy, a stark reminder of how fragile the historical record can be, especially for those who operate on the margins of power. Every lost Micheaux film is a lost piece of American history, a lost perspective, a lost voice from a world that was systematically silenced. What we have left is a precious and incomplete picture of a monumental artistic achievement. And as the years went on, the man himself began to fade from view, just like his films. By the late 1940s, the world that Oscar Micheaux had helped to create was beginning to leave him behind. The golden age of independent, race films was drawing to a close. A new generation of black audiences, shaped by the experiences of the Great Depression and World War II, had different tastes. They were more sophisticated, more demanding, and increasingly, they had more options. The very Hollywood that had once ignored them was now beginning, however slowly and imperfectly, to integrate black actors into mainstream films, albeit often in minor or stereotyped roles. The monolithic wall of segregation in cinema was beginning to show cracks, and ironically, this made the space for a completely separate black cinema smaller. Micheaux's style of filmmaking, born of necessity and constrained by shoestring budgets, began to feel dated to some. His films, with their sometimes preachy moralizing, their theatrical acting, and their rough technical edges, couldn't compete with the slick production values of the Hollywood studio system. He was a man of the silent era, a pioneer who had mastered one form of storytelling, and the transition to the more complex and expensive world of sound cinema was a constant struggle. His final film, The Betrayal, released in 1948, was an ambitious 3-hour epic that he hoped would be his masterpiece. But it was a commercial and critical failure. The audiences were no longer there in the same numbers. The cultural moment had shifted. He had spent his entire life fighting, hustling, willing a cinematic universe into existence through sheer force of will. But now, in his late 60s, the old warrior was tired. The industry he had built from scratch was fading, and his own contributions were already beginning to be overlooked. He died in 1951, while on one of his signature promotional tours, traveling through Charlotte, North Carolina. He died as he had lived, on the road, fighting to get his story seen. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Great Bend, Kansas, a place he had passed through as a Pullman porter decades before. The man who had been the single most important and prolific black filmmaker of his generation, the titan who had challenged the birth of a nation, the mentor who had discovered Paul Robeson, had vanished from the world with barely a whisper. The New York Times, the paper of record, did not even run an obituary. For decades, that was where the story ended. Oscar Micheaux became a ghost, a half-forgotten name known only to a handful of film scholars and elderly moviegoers. His surviving films gathered dust in archives, when they weren't lost or destroyed. In the mainstream histories of American cinema, he was either a footnote or completely absent. The narrative was written by the victors, and in the war against Hollywood, Micheaux had, it seemed, ultimately lost. The system he had fought against had simply outlasted him, absorbing and sanitizing the very idea of black stories until his own raw, independent voice seemed like a relic from a distant past. But a legacy that powerful does not die. It merely goes dormant, waiting for a new generation to rediscover it. The process of Micheaux's resurrection began in the late 1960s and 70s, in the fiery heart of the Black Arts movement and the burgeoning field of black studies in American universities. A new generation of black scholars, artists, and activists, hungry for their own history, began digging. They were looking for their cultural ancestors, for the pioneers who had fought the battles that made their own work possible. And they found Oscar Micheaux. They found his surviving films, and they were stunned. They saw not a primitive, technically flawed filmmaker, but a radical, fearless visionary. They saw a man who had tackled themes of lynching, passing, and institutional racism half a century before it was fashionable. They saw a director who had created a universe of complex, dignified, and powerful black characters. They saw, in his work, the very DNA of an independent black cinema. He was not a footnote, he was the founding father. This academic and artistic rediscovery began to seep into the broader culture. Film societies held retrospectives of his work. His surviving films were restored and re-released. Books and scholarly articles were written, painstakingly reconstructing his life and career. He became a hero to a new generation of black filmmakers, most notably Spike Lee, who has repeatedly cited Micheaux as a primary inspiration. Spike Lee's own production company, 40 Acres and a Mule, is a direct homage to the kind of independent, entrepreneurial spirit that Micheaux embodied. The recognition became more official. In 1986, the Directors Guild of America honored him with a Golden Jubilee Special Directorial Award. A year later, he was given a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. The irony was profound. The very industry that had ignored and marginalized him his entire life now literally cemented his name into its own sidewalk, claiming him as one of its own. His unmarked grave in Kansas was finally given a proper headstone, paid for by fans and filmmakers who understood his importance. Oscar Micheaux, the ghost, was finally being given his due. The battle for his memory, the one he could not win in his own lifetime, was being won by the generations that followed. So what is the final, enduring legacy of Oscar Micheaux? It is a legacy far more profound than just the number of films he made, or the barriers he broke. He was more than a pioneer. He was a prophet of a new kind of power. In an era when the primary struggle for Black Americans was focused on the political and legal battles for basic rights, Micheaux understood a deeper, more insidious truth, that the war for freedom is also a war of the imagination. He knew that if you allow your enemy to tell your story, you will always be the villain or the fool. The battle for the screen was, for him, a battle for the soul. His life's work stands as a monumental testament to the power of representation. He was not just making movies, he was creating a counter-narrative to the toxic and pervasive lies of American popular culture. Every time he put a black doctor, a black lawyer, or a black hero on the screen, he was committing an act of cultural rebellion. He was showing his audience, and the world, a reality of black life that the dominant culture refused to see. He was asserting their humanity, their complexity, and their right to be the protagonists of their own stories. In an age of mass media, where images shape our perceptions of ourselves and others, this was not just art, it was a form of psychological liberation. He was decolonizing the American screen, one film at a time. Furthermore, his entire career was a masterclass in economic self-determination. He was the living embodiment of the philosophies of Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey. He did not wait for Hollywood to give him a seat at the table. He went out and built his own table, with his own tools, and funded by his own community. The Micheaux Film and Book Company was more than just a studio. It was a symbol of black capitalism and entrepreneurial genius. The fact that he raised his initial capital from the small investments of ordinary black people is a crucial part of his story. He was proving that the community had the power to create its own institutions, to fund its own art, and to control its own image, without the permission or approval of the white establishment. He was a filmmaker, yes, but he was also a nation builder, and the nation he was building was a nation of the mind, a place where black people could see themselves as powerful, dignified, and free. His battles with censorship are also a key part of his legacy. His constant fights with review boards across the country were not just about the content of his films, they were about the very definition of free speech in America. He was arguing for the right to tell uncomfortable truths, to depict the brutal reality of racism, even if it made white audiences uneasy. When the censors told him that his depiction of a lynching would incite racial hatred, they were revealing their true fear, not that black people would become violent, but that white people would be forced to confront their own complicity in that violence. Micheaux was fighting for a more honest, more challenging, and ultimately, a more adult form of cinema. He was a free speech warrior, who understood that the power to censor is the power to control reality itself. And yet, his legacy is also a complex and sometimes contradictory one. Some modern critics have pointed to his occasional use of colorism, his focus on the black middle class at the expense of the poor and working class, and his sometimes conservative social values as flaws in his vision. These criticisms are valid and important. Micheaux was a product of his time, and his films reflect some of the complex and often painful internal politics of the black community. But to focus solely on these flaws is to miss the revolutionary nature of his achievement. He was not perfect. He was a man, wrestling with the immense contradictions of his era, trying to forge a new vision with the limited tools at his disposal. The fact that his work is complex and even problematic at times does not diminish his importance, it confirms it. It shows that he was not creating simple propaganda, but grappling with the real, messy, and often difficult truths of black life in America. He was not a saint, he was an artist, and a warrior. We began this journey with The Shadow of a Cinematic Monster, The Birth of a Nation, a film that used the power of the screen to poison the soul of America. The story of Oscar Micheaux is the story of the man who stood up in the darkness of that theater, looked at the flickering lies on the screen, and refused to accept them as reality. He did not just get angry, he got a camera. And in doing so, he taught us the most important lesson of the modern age: you cannot fight a powerful story with silence. You must fight it with a better story. His life is a testament to the fact that the most radical act can be the act of creation. In a world that sought to define him, he chose to define himself. In an industry that offered him the role of a caricature, he chose to be the author of his own epic. He was a filmmaker, yes, but that title is too small. He was a myth breaker and a myth maker. He took the racist myths of Hollywood and shattered them, and in their place, he built a new mythology, a mythology of black resilience, black intelligence, and black beauty. He was building an arc of images, a visual record to carry his people's true story through the flood of lies. His entire career was an act of audacious, unapologetic self-belief. Think of the courage it took. The courage to walk away from a deal that compromised his vision. The courage to sell shares in a dream door to door. The courage to put the horror of a lynching on screen when no one had ever dared. The courage to fight the censors, to rebuild after fires, to keep going when the world told him he was finished. He was a one-man studio, a one-man movement, fueled by a conviction that what he was doing mattered more than the immense obstacles in his path. He was not just making films, he was carving out a space for his people to exist in the cultural imagination of the world. So why does his story matter so much today, in an age of seemingly infinite content and diverse voices? It matters because his battle is still our battle. The fight for who gets to tell the story, and whose story gets told, is the central cultural fight of our time. Every debate we have about representation in Hollywood, every time we demand more complex and authentic characters, every time we celebrate a film from a director of color who breaks through the system, we are walking on the path that Oscar Micheaux hacked out of the wilderness with his own 2 hands. He is the spiritual godfather of every independent filmmaker, every artist of color, every storyteller who has ever been told that their story is not commercial, not universal, not important. His life is a roadmap for defiance. It teaches us that you do not need the permission of the powerful to create. You do not need to wait for the gatekeepers to open the gates. You can, through sheer grit, entrepreneurial hustle, and a direct connection to your community, build your own gates. He proved that cultural power does not have to flow from the top down, it can be built from the ground up. The next time you watch a film by Spike Lee, by Ava DuVernay, by Jordan Peele, by Ryan Coogler, you are seeing the legacy of Oscar Micheaux. The very existence of a vibrant black cinema today is a testament to his pioneering sacrifice. He was the one who kicked down the first door, who proved it could be done, who laid the foundation upon which everything else has been built. He was forgotten for a time, but his influence is undeniable. It is in the very DNA of modern black storytelling. So let us remember him not as a primitive filmmaker with rough edges, but as a revolutionary warrior who chose a camera as his weapon. Let us remember him as the man who looked at Hollywood's lies and answered with his own truth. He was told his people's story was worthless. He proved it was a treasure. He was told he was invisible. He created a universe where he and his people were the stars. Hollywood may have written history with lightning, but Oscar Micheaux answered with the enduring, life-giving fire of truth. His work is a testament, his life a lesson, and his legacy a challenge to us all, to pick up our own cameras, our own pens, our own voices, and to tell the stories that must be told. The war for the American imagination is never over. And Oscar Micheaux was its first, and perhaps its greatest, general. To fully grasp the magnitude of Oscar Micheaux's achievement, we must see him not just as a black filmmaker, but as a quintessential American figure, an embodiment of the nation's most cherished and most contradictory ideals. He was, in the purest sense of the word, a frontiersman. But the frontier he conquered was not one of land, but of perception. The wilderness he tamed was not the physical plains of South Dakota, but the vast, hostile wilderness of the American mind, a landscape overgrown with the thorny weeds of prejudice and bigotry. His camera was his axe, and his films were the clearings he carved out, spaces where a new kind of civilization, a new way of seeing, could take root. His story is a profound meditation on the relationship between art and power. Micheaux understood, perhaps more deeply than any artist of his time, that art is never just art. It is always political. The choice of who to put on screen, whose story to tell, whose perspective to validate, is one of the most powerful political acts in the modern world. Hollywood in his era was not merely producing entertainment, it was producing a reality. A reality in which white was heroic, powerful, and central, and black was subservient, comical, or menacing. Micheaux's entire career was a rejection of that manufactured reality. He was a cinematic realist in the truest sense, not because his films were always technically perfect, but because they were committed to a deeper, more complex human truth. He was also a figure of immense, almost paradoxical, duality. He was a fierce race man, a tireless champion of his people, yet his heroes were often those who succeeded by mastering the rules of the white capitalist world. He was a critic of American hypocrisy, yet he deeply believed in the American dream of the self-made man. He was an artist who had to be a relentless businessman, a visionary who had to be a pragmatic hustler. This complexity is not a contradiction, it is the very essence of his genius. He was a bridge between worlds, a man who had to navigate the treacherous currents of both the black and white American experiences. His films are a record of that navigation, a testament to the immense psychological and spiritual agility required to survive and create in such a deeply divided world. His life is also a powerful lesson in the nature of failure. By the standards of Hollywood, Oscar Micheaux's career ended in failure. His last film flopped. His company faded. He died in obscurity. But this is where the conventional definition of success proves itself to be so hollow. Micheaux's success was not measured in box office receipts or industry awards. His success was measured in the minds he changed, in the sense of pride he instilled in his audience, in the very existence of a body of work that proved something was possible. He succeeded by refusing to quit. He succeeded by telling the stories that no one else would. He succeeded every single time a young black child sat in a darkened theater and saw a hero on screen who looked like them. This redefines success not as a destination, but as the act of the journey itself. His life was a testament to the idea that the struggle itself is the victory. The fight to tell your own story, even if you don't win every battle, even if you are forgotten for a time, is an act of profound and enduring triumph. The seeds he planted took decades to fully bloom, but the forest of modern black cinema that exists today grew from the soil he first tilled. He did not live to see the harvest, but he was the one who first dared to plant in a barren and hostile ground. And so, his story becomes a universal one. It speaks to anyone who has ever felt like an outsider, anyone who has ever been told they don't belong, anyone who has ever had a vision that the world was not yet ready to see. It is a story about the power of a single, determined individual to create a world in their own image, even when the existing world is doing everything in its power to deny their existence. Oscar Micheaux was not just fighting for his people, he was fighting for the very idea that every person, regardless of their origin, has the right to be the author of their own story. He was a filmmaker, yes. But he was also a freedom fighter, and the territory he fought to liberate was the human imagination itself. That is a battle that never ends, and his example remains one of its most powerful and enduring weapons. We began this story in the flickering darkness of a movie theater in 1915, watching a cinematic monster cult. The Birth of a Nation poisoned the American soul. It was a film that used the most powerful art form of the new century to codify hatred, to glorify terrorists, and to depict black Americans as less than human. The story of Oscar Micheaux is the story of a man who looked at that all-consuming darkness and did not flinch. He did not just curse the darkness, he lit a match. And with that single, defiant flame, he began to burn a new path, illuminating a different truth for the entire world to see. His life is the ultimate testament to the fact that the most powerful weapon against a lie is not an argument. It is a better, more compelling truth. Hollywood built a fantasy of black inferiority. Micheaux responded by building a reality of black complexity, ambition, and dignity. They created caricatures. He created characters. They built a world of stereotypes. He built a cinematic universe of doctors, lawyers, cowboys, and heroes. He understood, on a level that was almost prophetic, that the battle for civil rights was not just a battle of laws and protests, but a battle for the narrative. He knew that if you could conquer the imagination, you could eventually conquer the world. Let us be clear about the scale of his audacity. He was a one-man studio in an age of titans. While the Hollywood moguls were building vast empires of plaster and dreams, Micheaux was on the road, a cinematic Johnny Appleseed, traveling from one dusty, segregated theater to the next, carrying his truth in film canisters. He was his own writer, his own director, his own producer, and his own distributor. He was a vertically integrated act of pure, unadulterated defiance. The sheer, relentless force of his will is a story in itself, a testament to what a single human being can accomplish when they are possessed by a purpose greater than themselves. His legacy is not found only in the grainy, flickering images of his surviving films. It is found in the very existence of a modern black cinema. He is the ghost in the machine, the spiritual ancestor of every black artist who has ever picked up a camera to tell their own story. His influence is in the unapologetic boldness of Spike Lee, in the historical grandeur of Ava DuVernay, in the genre-bending genius of Jordan Peele. They are all the children of Micheaux, whether they know it or not. He was the one who kicked the door open, who proved it was possible, who created the very idea that a black-owned, black-created, and black-controlled cinema could exist. So, when we look back on his life, let us not see him as a footnote. Let us see him as a founding father. He was not just a pioneer of race films, he was a pioneer of American independent cinema. He was doing then what the rebels of the 1970s would later be celebrated for, making personal, challenging, and socially conscious films outside the suffocating confines of the studio system. He was a maverick, a trailblazer, and a true American original. His life is a challenge to all of us. It challenges us to look at the stories we consume and ask, who is telling this story? Whose voice is being heard, and whose is being silenced? It challenges us, as artists and creators, to not wait for permission, to not bow to the gatekeepers, but to find our own way to tell the stories that burn within us. And it challenges us, as a society, to finally recognize that the American story is not one single narrative. It is a complex, often contradictory, and beautiful chorus of millions of different voices. Oscar Micheaux spent his entire life fighting to make sure his voice, and the voices of his people, were heard in that chorus. He was told his story didn't matter. He turned it into an epic. He was told his people were invisible. He made them the stars. He was given a world of racist lies. He left us a legacy of cinematic truth. The war that began in that darkened theater in 1915 is not over. The battle for the American soul, for the American imagination, continues to this day. But we do not go into that battle unarmed. We have the example of the man who fought it first, the man who fought it alone, the man who proved that the most powerful thing in the world is a story whose time has come. His name was Oscar Micheaux. And his story is, and will always be, an American masterpiece.